So our next lesson comes from Exodus 16. Exodus 16th chapter. So we're looking at two different passages. The first one is going to be 2 through 4, and the second one is going to be 13 through 20. I like the Old Testament because there's lots of things about food there, but we're not looking at anything that is trying to create a new law. We're not saying that this is what you have to do for salvation or anything like that, right? We're just learning lessons, principles that we can apply to honor our bodies and honor God, but we're not creating any new laws. So Exodus 16, 2 through 4. Then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, "Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, and we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not." And then we jump down to verse 13, and we're going to go from 13 to 20. So it reads, "So it was that quail came up at the evening and covered the camp. And in the morning the dew lay all around the camp. And when the layer of dew lifted, there, on the surface of the wilderness, was a small round substance, as fine as frost on the ground. So when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, 'What is it?' For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, 'This is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. This is the thing which the Lord had commanded. Let every man gather it according to each one's needs, 1 omer for each person, according to the number of persons. Let every man take for those who are in his tent.' Then the children of Israel did so and gathered, some more, some less. And when they had measured it by omers, he who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. Every man had gathered according to each one's need. And Moses said, Let no one leave any of it till morning. Notwithstanding, they did not heed Moses. But some of them left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them." All right. So this is a fascinating story. So it takes place as the people are moving through the wilderness from Egypt to the Promised Land, right? So, they were in Egypt. They were slaves in Egypt. We know the story. They're slaves in Egypt. And then God moves them from Egypt into the land of Canaan, the Promised Land. 40 years, kind of walking around in a circle in the wilderness until God takes them into the Promised Land, right? Mm-hmm. So now this takes place shortly after they've left Egypt. So they leave. Now, they were slaves, right? They were in bondage, right? Mm-hmm. They were in bondage. So, bondage is never a good thing, right? Like you didn't have freedom to do what you wanted to do. You didn't have freedom to express yourself, mm-hmm. right? Your personality was confined. Mm-hmm. You didn't have freedom. They couldn't worship the way they wanted to worship, right? They were restricted. Okay. They were enslaved. So then they get out in the wilderness. Now, whenever it is that you move bondage, or whatever that bondage is from, whether it's political bondage or as bad diet or whatever it is that's confining you and not allowing you to be your full and best self, right? There's usually a wilderness period where you're going to have to walk through something that is uncomfortable, right? It's not like you go from bondage to great place and there's no middle area, right? You got to go through this wilderness period where things are uncomfortable, where you are stretched and you are perhaps unhappy, uncomfortable, and then eventually you make it to the promised place, right? So Israel's in this midst, right? So they get out there, they're away from Egypt, and then now they're hungry, right? And they start complaining about them being hungry. So they say in their complaints, one of the things they say is that, hey, when we were in Egypt, we had all the meat we wanted, and we had bread till we were full. So they start complaining, right? They're complaining to Moses. Essentially, they're saying that their bondage was better than their freedom, right? My bondage was better than my freedom. Now that I'm free, I'm starving. So, but you should just kill me back when I was in bondage, right? So, of course, this is annoying, right? So Moses takes this to God, right? So Moses talks to God about it. So God said, "Don't worry. I'll feed you," right? So one of the things that God does is that He says, in the morning time, when you wake up in the morning, there's going to be food on the ground. So all you got to do is wake up, right? They're not farming anything like that. They're not farming any lands. You're not doing any of those things. All they're doing is waking up. As the dew lifts, there's going to be all these like wafers on the ground, right? And so sure enough, the wafers come. Now God tells them very, 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 very clearly. He says, listen, when the wafers come, you get enough for your household. So if your household is 5 people, then you get enough for 5 people. If your household is 10 people, then you get enough for 10 people, right? You get enough for your household. Now, nobody is ever to try to save the food for the next day. The food comes fresh every day. The only exception was that on the 6th day, they're going to get double portion, so that on the Sabbath day, they didn't have to go out and get it, right? But except for the Sabbath day preparation, no one is supposed to keep any food extra left over, right? Every day you're getting fresh food, right? That was the promise. So the people, so sure enough, right? They go to bed, they wake up, the dew rises, and there's all these wafers on the ground, right? And the people had never seen it before. They didn't know what it was. So they called it manna, right? They called it manna. Now, in Hebrew, manna means, what is it? They didn't know what it was. They couldn't identify it. They said, they called it, what is it? If we were to do it in English, we would say, what is it? That would be the name of the bread. Because none of us knows what it is, right? It's manna. Now, so the bread comes every day, and they didn't know what it was, but they described it as the bread of heaven. Because this bread came from God. So it was the bread. So it was good bread, right? It was a choice bread. And there's another verse that's not quoted. It's not in the scripture, but it's another verse that it says that it tasted like coriander, and it had this like pleasant texture and this pleasant taste. And if you read the ancient Hebrew text, they talk about how the old ancient Israel rabbi said that the bread tastes like whatever it was that people could imagine, right? It was up to your imagination how the bread tastes, right? Yeah, so it could have tasted like chicken. If you like chicken, you would ate this bread, it would taste like chicken, right? Right. So now, several things happen, right? Several things happen with this story that make it a bit of a disaster for Israel. One, the people decided to save it. Now God said, "Don't save it," right? You get enough, and then let it go. But the people decided they wanted to save it, right? They wanted extra, right? Now you're getting it fresh every day, right? But that's not good enough. So people wanted extra, right?
So when you say that they lost their faith, or they were starting to lose their faith in God?
Yeah, I pretty much. Pretty much that's what happened, right? Because God promised them every day is going to be here. Right. They heard the promise. Right. They ate to their heart's content, and they still put it in packages. They tried to put it in Tupperware for the next day, right? Y'all, I know y'all do that sometimes, right? They put it in the Tupperware and they try to save it for the next day. So now what happened to it, right? It turned into worms, and it started stinking, right? It started smelling, right? The people had enough food, but enough wasn't enough, right? Enough wasn't enough. They were greedy, right? Don't get you nowhere, right? So not only did they get their food that day, they wanted their food for tomorrow, even though tomorrow was promised a new meal. So, right, this is a big problem. One, they're not trusting in God. But then two, right, they're just being greedy. You being greedy, right? So now, if I make an analogy between that scenario and then us, right? Now, let's say I go somewhere. Let's say I go to a church meal. And at the church meal, they got all this food out there, right? This church haven't studied the lesson about the feast. So in their imagination, feast just means everybody eat till you pass out. So you go to this church and you get your food, you eat, you pass out, but you realize there's some more left over, right? So then you get your Tupperware and then you put it all in there. Now you already full, right? You already full. You put your Tupperware in there, and then I take it to my house so that when I get bored, I can eat some more. Not because I'm necessarily going to be hungry. Not because my food doesn't have any. My house doesn't have any food in it. Just because I want extra, right? Now, I can say I'm guilty of that, right? I'm guilty of. I go to work. I wake up in the morning sometimes. I had breakfast, right? Now, I had breakfast, right? God blessed me with breakfast in the morning. I ate the breakfast. I was satisfied. I get to work. Now, when I get to work, a coworker has brought in donuts and all this other stuff, right? Now, I already ate my breakfast, right? But the donut is sitting there looking at me, right? Eat me. Exactly. And it's not, I'm going to eat that donut, not because I'm hungry. Not because I'm lacking anything. Because you're greedy. But because I'm greedy, right? Now what happens? What happens to my body when I consume that extra?
Fat holds on to it.
Yeah, it begins to do harm for my body. So we saw for Israel, when they kept the food extra, it grew worms. It began to stink. It was a nuisance. It was a burden. The extra became a burden. Right? So now, if I eat at my house, and then I go to work, and then someone has brought in all these other things, and I act as though I haven't eaten at all, I just eat a second meal. That's greedy. That's greedy, right? So that extra becomes a burden for me also, right? It becomes a burden. Now I may have been good that morning. I may have made my own lunch, and then I walk down the street and I see something that says free pizza, and I'm like, oh, you know what? That says free. Because it says free, I feel like I got to take it, right? Now I've already got food. So there's a mentality. I call it the mentality of overeating. Sometimes I'm not sure if it's because we're not necessarily trusting God enough to provide for tomorrow, or we just our eyes are never full and we're therefore overindulgent, or whatever it is. But what I know is that there's a tendency for me to think that because food is free, that means I must eat it. You don't have to overdo it, because whenever you overdo it, it leads to destruction, essentially, right? That you're gonna draw worms. It's gonna stink. There's no benefit in over consuming, and that's the lesson that God is telling Israel. And Israel had to learn the hard way, because even though they had enough and they were full, they were still prone to overconsume, right? And then the second thing that was wrong with that comes through this lesson is that Israel complained about the manna, right? God gave them bread from heaven. Amen. Of course, it was unusual. Right. It wasn't what they were used to eating. It was bread from heaven, but it was a great gift. He was giving them angels' food, right? And the people said, oh, because this is not what I ate last week, I'm not really happy. I'm not satisfied with it. You give me something else.
But he was giving them that to sustain them, right?
He was giving them that to sustain them. It was a better food.
At that time.
At that time, it was a better food. It was a better food, but it was unusual. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we can reject better foods because they're unusual, right? So if someone says, hey, why don't you eat this salad? And this salad has leafy green vegetables, I may reject it because it's unusual. If someone says, if I'm used to eating meat every single day, twice a day, and then someone says, hey, why don't you have some beans instead of having the meat? That'll really lower your cholesterol. You might lose some weight. It'll lower your blood pressure. And I say, well, no, listen, I'm 40 years old. I've been all my whole life. I've been eating meat. I'm going to eat meat. I ate meat yesterday. I'm eating meat tomorrow. I got to have my meat. That mentality is not one that worked well for Israel, because God has given them something that is brand new. It's better for them. And if they had a broad imagination, they could make it into whatever they wanted. But they rejected it because it wasn't what they were used to. And then for us, a lot of times when it comes to eating new healthy foods, we say, I don't like that food. I don't like the way it tastes. But it boils down to your imagination. Because if you know that these foods are healthy for you, then you can figure out ways to make those foods taste quite well.